Hi, everybody. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, Texas on February the 6th. Welcome to our video commentary. Today, we're going to remember a couple of personalities, some of the two biggest personalities of the 20th century who were born on this day, February the 6th. I'm talking about Babe Ruth, who was born on this day in 1895, and Ronald Reagan, President Reagan, who was born on this day in 1911. These two men, they both came from humble backgrounds, and they went on, of course, to achieve the very top or to reach the top in their respective fields. Babe Ruth was actually born in Baltimore. He was born in a very rough neighborhood, a rough family, had a rough childhood. And I guess when he was a teenager, his parents decided that they needed to bring some discipline to the young man, so they put him in a Catholic school so that he could be away from the streets. And there in the Catholic school, he met a man named Matthias, Brother Matthias, who saw that young Ruth had a talent to play baseball. And he directed Ruth in that direction. Ruth eventually signed with the Red Sox and became a very successful left-handed pitcher. In fact, he has a World Series record as a pitcher for the Red Sox. And then in 1920, the owner of the Red Sox needed some money, so he sold Babe Ruth to the Yankees, and that was sort of the beginning of the legendary career of Ruth as a Yankee. With the Yankees, they put him in right field, and he started hitting home runs, and he became really the biggest player in baseball. Ruth came to the game at a very important time because the game was suffering and having a hard time recovering from the scandal of the 1917 World Series, when there were allegations that the mob or the mafia and players had thrown the series. And the game had suffered a great deal. It had a very big black eye. So Ruth came along at the right time. And people once again took an interest in baseball. They began to buy tickets. And he became really the biggest story in sports in the 1920s. I mean, he was the top player, the top athlete in the United States in the 1920s into the early 1930s. In fact, at one time they asked Ruth, who had a great, he was very charismatic. He had a great ability to answer questions. And they asked him, you're making more money than the president of the United States. And Ruth replied with that great sense of humor that he had, well, I had a better year than he did. And that's exactly the way it was with Babe Ruth. He died in 1948 of cancer, but he set two of the biggest legendary records of baseball: 60 home runs in a season and 714 home runs for a career. Both of those records were broken, of course, by Roger Maris, 61 and 61, and then Henry Aaron, 755 or 715 in 1974. Now, the other great personality is Ronald Wilson Reagan, who was born on this day in Tampico, Illinois in 1911. Mr. Reagan, again, middle-class type family. He went on to a small college there in Illinois, Eureka, Illinois, Eureka College. He worked as a radio announcer for a while. In fact, there's a great story that he was once calling a football game, and on the field was a young man named Gerald Ford, who was playing for the University of Michigan. So you had a future president calling the game and a future president on the field for the University of Michigan. Then he went to Hollywood. He wanted to be an actor. He became an actor, made a bunch of movies actually, but he was never what they would call the number one actor. He was always like the number two guy in the movies, and he would always play backup to Errol Flynn, although he did make a lot of movies on his own, but he was never a top actor like Errol Flynn or Clark Gable, some of the other guys that he was in the movies with. After the movies, he became the president of the Actors Union in Hollywood, and that's when he became interested in politics. Then in the 1960s, 1964, he gave a big speech for Barry Goldwater in that election of 64, and that was kind of the beginning of his political reputation. He became governor of California for 2 terms, and then in 1980 became president of the United States for 2 terms, 2 very successful terms. When he ran for re-election, he carried 49 states, came within a few thousand votes of actually winning every state in the Union. He lost Minnesota to Walter Mondale. But like Babe Ruth, who came along at a very important time for the game of baseball and the business of baseball, Ronald Reagan came along at a very important time for the United States. The country needed leadership. It needed to believe again in itself. And Reagan provided that charm, that smile, that tough leadership, that wonderful leadership. And that's how we remember Reagan, as the great communicator, the man who could communicate and just make you feel better. And that was the kind of guy that he was. And like Ruth, they were two of the great personalities of the 20th century. Well, there you have a little story of Babe Ruth and Ronald Reagan, who were born on this day. Ruth in 1895, Reagan in 1911. Ruth died in 1948 at a young age. She died of cancer. And Mr. Reagan died in 2004 at 91, I believe, when he passed away. Have a wonderful day, everybody. Thank you for watching. We have all of these over at YouTube. We have them on Twitter, and we have them on our blog. Thank you, and bye-bye.